I think people are done. You're going to see a massive, in my view, economic boom. I think we're going to have an extremely strong economy come the fall. I think people are going to return.
Well, you laid it out correctly in the intro. Inflation is a tax, and the source is government, because that's who taxes us. The only way to reduce inflation would be to dramatically cut government spending, because government spending is being paid for through inflation. We're running record budget deficits. And so instead of taking our money and spending it, the government is taking our purchasing power by printing new money and spending that. So the increase in prices that we're all experiencing is the tax that we are paying to finance government. In addition, the Federal Reserve is trying to prop up the stock market, prop up the real estate market, and prop up the U.S. government. It can only do that by keeping interest rates artificially low. But in order to do that, the Fed has to keep printing money to buy bonds. So as long as the Fed is artificially suppressing interest rates, it is going to have to create inflation to do it. And because we have so much debt, the Fed is now forced to keep interest rates at zero. So unfortunately, average Americans, the middle class and the working poor are going to suffer the most severe bout of inflation in U.S. history, far greater than anything experienced during the decade of the 1970s.
Well, let me go to Pete here in Great Barrington. I mean, one of the explanations I've been told, and it's basically coming from the Fed, this is all temporary, it's bent up demand, it's gonna, it'll smooth out but that's not happening here, okay? And I mentioned the working class, middle class people in my introduction intentionally, because I was small, I was young, but I do remember the 1970s, and that was a very, very dreary time. Are we seeing a repeat of that? Go ahead, Pete.
Yeah, I remember stagflation too as a kid in the 70s. So I agree with everything that Peter just said, Peter Schiff. But I do want to add the following. We did have a massive increase in the money supply in 2020, just over 25% in a space of a few months, which is definitely a cause for concern. But a lot of people are looking at the year-over-year CPI numbers. And it's not enough to look at the headline number. You have to look at what makes up the index. There's two big contributors to the recent jump. Right. So first you have gasoline and oil in the energy basket, which were up over 50% year over year. But you have to remember that about a year ago this time, we had a situation where Russia and Saudi Arabia unleashed a flood of oil into the markets when demand was plummeting because of lockdowns. So you've had this surge in oil prices, but it's come from where at one point we had West Texas International or Intermediate rather at negative $32 and negative $34 a barrel. The second thing is we've had a huge spike in used cars and auto insurance, 30% and 17% increases respectively, which has to do with shortages and people getting back on the road. So there are signs of inflation. It's worrisome. But in terms of the CPI number, while I'm not an inflation dove, that's not very alarming. What we see in financial markets, that's more alarming.
Okay, well, let's go to our guest in Moscow here. Sophia, I'm very concerned. I mean, if you look at it globally, where is most of this inflation coming from? Because we have a lot of Western governments have pumped huge amounts of money, which I find really, in some cases, it was absolutely necessary. I don't have a problem with that. But I mean, there's so much money that has been allocated to be pumped into the economy. Is it really necessary right now? Because from what I understand, a lot of these glowing, GDP numbers and all that, they're saying, oh, they're all great. But is that counting inflation? Is inflation pumping up those numbers? They're not really real numbers here. Can you make an assessment on a global scale when it comes to inflation? Because we just mentioned oil, used cars, Saudi Arabia, Russia. Globally, where is the biggest tripping point, if I could put it that way? Go ahead.
Well, I would say that we're not talking about like any scenarios like stagflation, first of all, just because the spike of inflation is exactly the product of the recovery of demand. And it's like, probably most unusual is that it's a very, very symmetric across the globe. And the reaction to the crisis was very symmetric across the globe. So it was quite different from previous two crises, just because like not only advanced economies offered excessive stimulus, not only from a fiscal side, but also from a monetary side. But first time in 2 decades, emerging markets also offered quite an easing of the monetary policy. So that's actually makes it a global phenomenon. But I would disappoint you, but as a former, or probably being a former central banker, I'm on that side who believe that inflation is a temporary effect for now.
Okay, well, that's interesting because you can that's the perspective I keep getting here. Let me go back to Peter here. Is the Fed being responsible here? Because, I mean, it's just not over the last 14 months or so that we've seen increased huge injections here. We've seen a lot of really easy money for a long time now, and then it got supercharged. Go ahead, Peter.
Yeah. Well, remember, the Federal Reserve is never responsible. So why should they change now? But remember, one of the other things the Fed is never is honest, right? The Fed is all about spin. It's all about trying to. So if you recall, early in the mortgage crisis, when the subprime market blew up and the threat to the entire mortgage market was obvious, as was the threat to the economy, what did the Federal Reserve do? They came out and reassured everybody that there was nothing to worry about, that the subprime problems were contained. Why did they do that? Because they were hoping that by denying that the problem existed, maybe they could somehow will it out of existence and somehow get people to change their behavior in the face of what should have been an obvious crisis, and they were hoping to avert it. And I think they're doing the same thing now. The Fed has absolutely no ability to fight inflation. So why even acknowledge that it's a threat when you can't do anything about it? So the only thing the Fed can do is deny, lie to the markets, tell everybody that it's all temporary. And that explains their failure to act. But their real failure to act is because it's impossible. Because the only way to fight inflation is to turn off the monetary spigots, to raise interest rates of Card's economy that they've erected. We have a worse financial crisis than 2008. The government would be forced to slash spending dramatically. They may even have to default on the national debt. Who knows what would happen if the Fed actually fought inflation? So because they can't, they're just denying the problem. But there is absolutely no evidence to suggest what we're really experiencing is the beginning of a long overdue, huge increase in the cost of living, not only the result of the inflation that the Fed has created since the pandemic, but of all the inflation that we created before the pandemic that we've yet to deal with.
So just to rewind, if we go back just a few weeks, we announced the transaction, and a couple weeks later, before we signed the deal, the SEC came to us and said, we have some concern about whether RemainCo, this entity we were creating, was going to become an investment company. In order to address the SEC's concern, we changed the structure of the deal to provide that we were going to contribute the stock that we purchased to a trust. And we thought that would address the issue. And then we signed the deal, and then we pushed forward with the transaction. And then actually in this last few days, the SEC raised, I would say, a deal killer, which is they said that in their view, the transaction did not meet the New York Stock Exchange SPAC rules. And what that meant, I would call that a dagger in the heart of the transaction, and put Tontine in a very awkward spot. And we love Universal. We were excited to bring this deal to the Pershing Square Tontine shareholders. Not being able to do the transaction, we offered to take it off the hands of the public company. That was actually built into the transaction, the right to assign to an affiliate. And we've also assumed an indemnity obligation, some expenses, so that we put Tontine kind of back in the place where it was as if we hadn't done the deal. And now we have 18 months to find another transaction, and that one's going to be a merger. This one we structured the way we did really to accommodate the ability to acquire Universal because we were so excited about the business and we wanted to be owned by our shareholders. SEC didn't like it, and therefore we're going to do a more conventional merger. But our intent was to do a merger all along. It was really Vivendi's, some issues on their side that caused us to structure the deal this way.
Bill, was this just too complicated? I think a lot of us, including myself, struggled to be able to articulate and explain to the public what exactly this was. It was very different in many ways than a traditional SPAC. Clearly, the investors also felt perhaps that this was too complex because they started selling effectively the shares and they fell in price.
Sure. So what happened was, I think, we really have two kinds of investors. When we went public, we got to select all the investors, and we picked investors who had a very long-term orientation. They wanted to, they were kind of going to be partners with us in buying a business we own for the next, multiple years. In our case, probably a decade or more. And then I would say the Reddit community got excited about Tontine, and a lot of shorter-term investors came in and said, look, I want to bet on a deal being announced, the day one pop. A lot of those investors were levered. A lot of those investors bought options. And we announced a deal that, unfortunately, is very bad if you're levered or if you own options, because when the requirement to put the stock in a trust account is very detrimental if you're a margin holder. It's also very detrimental if you're an option holder. So we probably had none of those investors came into the IPO, but by the time of announcement, about a third of our stock, I think, was held by people hoping, that we're going to announce a transaction where the stock doubles, if you will, the first day. There are a lot of investors that have been investing in SPACs that way, and I have no issue with a short-term investor, and we didn't design the transaction to affect short-term investors, but we were really focused on creating kind of long-term value. What's interesting is all of these problems go away by the end of the year. The issues that people were concerned about is, one, my stock that you buy and I'm not going to get for 4 months. It's going to sit in a trust account. We didn't like that, but that was really something we had to do for regulatory reasons.
But Bill,
another issue, Universal. Just stick with it for 1 second. But Universal is going to be a Dutch-listed company. People didn't love that, but we believed, by the time that we distributed the stock to shareholders, it would likely be, hopefully, be a New York Stock Exchange-listed company. So each of these problems, if you could hold the stock for 6 months, I think people would do very, very well. But unfortunately, I would say a meaningful percentage of our investors needed to hold it for a much shorter period of time, and it had a negative impact on them, and that I think has driven the stock down. I hope what it does is it motivates anyone who doesn't have a vaccine to get a vaccine. I don't think it's going to change behavior to a great extent. I think people are done, I am, with being in a cave, right? Hiding from the rest of the world. They want to go out. They're going to have fun. They're going to go to restaurants. You're going to see a massive, in my view, economic boom. On the margin, there'll be some people who are afraid. Some people who are afraid of getting a vaccine, and they're therefore afraid of going out. But I think we're going to have an extremely strong economy come the fall. I think people are going to return to work in September. And I think companies are going to insist on vaccines, and I think it's a good thing. And, I have, even some people in my own company that I would say we probably 3 people who haven't gotten a vaccine. And, in one case, sort of a philosophical objection or maybe a religious one. And, my question is, you take antibiotics, you take other drugs. If you can take an antibiotic for, some other kind of infection, why won't you, have a vaccine? And would you rather? And other people are concerned about the risk, and the risk is, in my view, a lot greater that you get COVID than if you look at the side effects from getting. So
what's going to be the Bill Ackman policy at the office?
Of vaccines.
What's going to be the policy? So for those 3 people who haven't been vaccinated.
Yeah, so I'm doing my best to convince everyone who hasn't gotten a vaccine by being convincing, and then by the time everyone comes back to work, we'll decide what we're going to do about our vaccine policy.
Also want to ask you just more broadly.
93%. Yeah.
I wanted to ask you about inflation, and both the inflation that we are seeing, maybe some of the supply chain issues that are creating some of this. The big question is this the new normal, or is it transitory?
I'm in closer to the new normal with respect to many sources of inflation. So one, I think inflation's understated. There's very, very significant they talk about home equivalent rents or ownership equivalent rents, And those are really understated. If you look at what's going on in the housing market, we have a housing boom. Talk to a home builder, everything's on allocation. You have to, and have a friend who knows the CEO in order to buy a home. So that you're seeing housing prices go way up. I think the way the data is collected for the kind of CPI or other inflation numbers really understate what's going on in housing, and that's approaching a third of inflation. So there's housing inflation, there's real wage inflation. One of the big issues, and I think this is not a transitory thing at all, which is recruiting. Trying to get people to come work in a hotel, work in a restaurant. I think it's harder now because of some of the stimulus. I think it'll be a little bit easier come September, but a lot of people have made sort of life choices and various things. I think you're going to have to pay people to come to work, and I think that's actually a big positive. It's probably a long-term positive for the economy. So you've had $5 trillion of stimulus, you have an increase in wages, you have a lot of savings, you have the stimulus of a lot of people being vaccinated around the same time. All of these things lead to massive, massive economic growth and demand, and we still have an extremely accommodative Federal Reserve. So I think rates are going up. I think rates are going up